1960 is often seen as a turning point in American cinema. Movies released before 1960 and after are essentially two different art forms. Although there are countless absolutely incredible films made before 1960 in America, the post-1960s renaissance of film pushed the boundaries of what film could do, and allowed the US to catch up with the rest of the world in terms of filmmaking experimentation. A multitude of reasons led to this shift in American cinema, so it's impossible to attribute the shift to a single film. But if I had to choose one film to be the catalyst, it would definitely be Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. Psycho is often regarded as one of the greatest movies ever made, dominating countless top 100 lists, and is widely seen as Hitchcock's best film. It's an immensely influential film that is referenced constantly, even 60 years after its release.
We all go a little mad sometimes.
To a point where even non-movie people know about it. Not only is Psycho an influential film for American cinema in general, but it also essentially created the new horror genre. Horror existed before Psycho, obviously, but it took the form mostly of monster movies. The Universal Monsters, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Blob. This was the landscape of horror pre-Psycho, whereas Night of the Living Dead, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and The Exorcist was the landscape of horror after Psycho. Although both of these are considered horror, they really feel like two separate genres. Alfred Hitchcock is widely known as the master of suspense. There are plenty of interviews where Hitchcock talks about how he creates tension and suspense, but I think it all boils down to the part of storytelling that Hitchcock has mastered, and that is knowing when to reveal information and when not to reveal information. His most famous example of creating suspense is his classic bomb under the table interview. Essentially, what Hitchcock says is that if you have two people at a table having small talk for 5 minutes, you have 5 boring minutes. But if at the end of the 5 minutes a bomb goes off from under the table, then you have 10 seconds of excitement from the audience. This is not how you build suspense. This is how you get 10 seconds of shock. Now, if we restart the scene and we tell the audience at the start that there's a bomb under the table, the small talk resumes for 5 minutes. Now the audience has 5 minutes of tension. The audience is stressed thinking, why are they talking about baseball? Don't they know there's a bomb next to their feet? Hitchcock knew that fear, tension, and suspense are not products of the aftermath, but created in the calm before the storm. The scariest part in Jaws is not when we see the shark, it's when we hear the music and don't see him yet. Our fight or flight kicks in when we suspect danger, so the implication that danger could be near is scarier than danger actually being there. One of the most tense scenes in any movie is the coin toss scene from No Country for Old Men. The audience knows who Anton Chigurh is and what he is capable of, so seeing him toy with this man keeps us on the edge of our seats the entire scene. One aspect of Hitchcock's bomb theory that I think people often overlook is how he ends it. The bomb must never go off. Hitchcock says that this will make the audience angry as you've changed what you have promised this audience. I find this fascinating because it goes directly against one of the prevailing storytelling concepts called Chekhov's gun. One of the aspects of Psycho that I think elevates it to one of the greatest films of all time is its ability to disobey Chekhov's gun, because the bomb never goes off in Psycho. Anton Chekhov was a Russian playwright and author who many consider one of the greatest storytellers of all time. Chekhov's gun is one of the most popular writing principles that Chekhov spoke about. The principle of Chekhov's gun is this: if in the first act you have hung a pistol on the wall, then in the following one it should be fired. Otherwise, don't put it there. Chekhov explained the same sentiment multiple times in his career in different analogies, but the core of Chekhov's gun is removing the unnecessary loose ends of a story and making sure each aspect is important and pays off in a satisfying way. Essentially, it is the art of setting up and paying off. Setups and payoffs are an easy to understand but wildly important aspect of storytelling. A great example of this is in Back to the Future. Early on in the movie, we hear about the clock tower in the town and how it stopped working when lightning hit it years ago. At first, this seems inconsequential until later in the movie when we realize that the lightning strike times perfectly to where Doc and Marty can use that to get back to the future. The setup for this climax happens in the first scene of the movie without the audience even realizing it. The audience doesn't yet understand the importance of the clock tower, but when Doc is freaking out about not having enough electricity, the attentive viewer that you are goes, aha, the lightning will strike, and then Doc comes to that realization, and it's satisfying when you get it right. If instead of using the lightning, Doc had a special battery that randomly had enough power, then the audience would feel cheated. Why bring up the clock tower at all if the solution is just a battery that was never discussed? In essentially every single movie you have ever seen, there has been a setup and a payoff. Some are more complex than others, but it's pretty much always there. Chekhov's gun is more than just setting up and paying off, though. It's truly about narrative efficiency. It's about not leaving unnecessary aspects in your story. It's to trim the fat. Chekhov's gun is not without criticism, though. Legendary writer Ernest Hemingway criticized Chekhov's gun as Hemingway appreciated the art of the inconsequential story piece. Just like any principle in art, it is a guideline, not a law. There were plenty of examples where not paying something off was intentional. The characters or plot point might be there simply for aesthetics or creating mood, especially in films with limited plot. Sometimes the lack of payoff is intentional on the filmmaker's part as a way to subvert the audience's expectations or make commentary on what the audiences expect. Chekhov's gun is a principle that can be broken, but one that should be learned first before breaking, so that you know how to break the principle effectively. Although I haven't found anywhere that Hitchcock directly mentions Chekhov's gun, I think it's apparent in his approach to tension that he would not necessarily agree with Chekhov. Hitchcock saying the bomb must never go off is a direct contradiction to Chekhov's gun. Hitchcock, especially in Psycho, loved to toy with the audience's expectations, and in the 60s, audiences were expecting anything but Psycho. Psycho had an interesting production. They began shooting in late 1959, making it well into Alfred Hitchcock's profound and successful career. By this point, Hitchcock was as much a household name as James Stewart and Katharine Hepburn, and he had cemented himself as a legend in the industry already. The film he released prior to Psycho was North by Northwest, a high-budget thriller romance with awesome set pieces and planes and Mount Rushmore starring the ever-charismatic Cary Grant. Psycho, however, was starkly different. Hitchcock originally struggled getting Psycho off the ground. Producers didn't think that the gritty story would work, so Hitchcock financed the film himself and had to cut more corners than normal. During the time of production and development, Hitchcock was show-running Alfred Hitchcock Presents, an anthology TV show. Because of the more constrained budget, Hitchcock used sets, crew, and equipment from Alfred Hitchcock Presents rather than a film set crew. He also shot in black and white rather than color to keep costs down as well. This was an odd shift considering North by Northwest had an incredibly high budget. This shift was a change for Hitchcock and audiences didn't know what to expect. Despite the low budget, Hitchcock was able to get Janet Leigh to star in the movie. Janet Leigh was a major star at the time and was plastered all over the posters and advertisements. This is the start of the extra-textual subversion of expectations that this film creates. By extra-textual, I mean something that is outside of the text that influences it. In Psycho, there's the extra-textual knowledge that Janet Leigh is a major star, and after seeing her face on the posters, anyone could easily assume she is the main character. And then when we follow her around for the majority of the beginning of the movie, it is solidified. Marion Crane is the protagonist of Psycho. So to subvert this, Marion Crane is killed about halfway through the movie. This is a crazy subversion of the audience's understanding of the star system in Hollywood, as well as just the audience's understanding of story structure. It's the shocking moment that leaves the viewer thinking, what the hell is going to happen next? Hitchcock is known for making thrillers and crime movies, and the movie is literally called Psycho, so people are expecting a psycho to start murdering people in the movie. So they start looking at each character, trying to figure out who the murderer is going to be, and what the motive is going to be. Early on in the film, we see who we assume is the main protagonist, considering the camera has been following her around. She is the main star of the picture, and was plastered all over the promotional materials. Marion Crane is working as a secretary where a sleazy businessman tasks her with depositing $40,000 into the work account. But rather than deposit it into the work account, she takes it for herself to pay for her boyfriend Sam's debts. This is the first sign of upcoming conflict in the movie. It isn't conflict just yet, but the audience can see how an embezzler would run into conflict with the owner of that money later in the film. In a 3-act structure, this would be the inciting incident. The inciting incident is the event in the story that jumpstarts the conflict. It's an event that quickly changes what the protagonist's life is and sets up the central theme and conflict within the story. Gandalf discovering the One Ring is the inciting incident of Lord of the Rings. From this very early moment, we know the conflict will be tied to this powerful and seemingly evil ring. In Jaws, the inciting incident is very early on when the shark attacks its first victim. From the first scene in the movie, we know the central conflict will be centered around the shark terrorizing the town. From the inciting incident of Psycho, we can tell the central conflict is going to be surrounding this embezzled money. But if you've seen the film, you know this is not true in the slightest. The money in embezzlement is Chekhov's gun being hung on the mantle, and the gun is never fired during the movie. Also, since the film is called Psycho, the audience is thinking, who is the psycho? Will it be Marion or will it be the businessman? Well, it's neither. The second piece of misdirection that Hitchcock throws at the viewers is the cop that follows Marion around. As Marion flees Phoenix and heads to California where Sam lives, she pulls to the side of the road as she becomes disoriented while driving. She is awoken by the officer coming up to her window and asking if she is okay. This scene is a perfect example of Hitchcock's bomb under the table. If this scene were the first scene in the movie and we had no other context, all we would know is this woman was sleeping in her car and a cop walks up. We don't know why the woman would be acting strange. However, Hitchcock told us what the bomb under the table would be, and that's the money that Marion had stolen. Although not a literal bomb, the money being found by the policeman would be a metaphorical bomb that would blow up in her face. So since we know about the money, this scene is tense as we don't want the cop to find the money and arrest her. And just like how Hitchcock says the bomb should never go off, the policeman does not find the money in this scene. Not only is this scene a great representation of the bomb under the table, but it's also another red herring. Another misdirection of setting up and paying off. That's because we're introduced to a new character, the policeman. Now at this point we might assume he is a one-off character and that this scene is just a short scene to build tension. But the tension is continued when we notice the officer is following Marion. Marion decides to change her car to make it harder to track her, so she stops at a dealership. To solidify that the cop is not just a one-off character, he shows up across the street from the car dealership and watches Marion. It's clear that the officer is suspicious of her activity and is being set up as a central conflict. The money was set up as a catalyst, and now the officer is introduced as an antagonist. Now the audience wonders if the officer is the titular psycho. The audience is certain that the officer is going to come up again because of the rule of threes. In writing, the rule of threes is a broad concept that events or things in your writing are more satisfying or impactful when they're in a group of three. An example of this is Goldilocks. There's 3 beds, one too small, one too big, one just right. The story of Goldilocks is much more interesting because there's 3 of them. If there were only 2, a big bed and a small bed, Goldilocks would pick the bigger bed just because it's better. However, adding the 3rd component makes the story more interesting, and the theme of just right makes more sense than the bigger is better than the smaller. There's also the 3 little pigs, the 3 musketeers, etc. And it's not just in fiction literature. In speeches or documents, there will often be 3 terms to emphasize a point. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Guns, germs, and steel. Weni, weedy, weechy. Stop, drop, and roll. The list goes on. In regards to Chekhov's gun, the rule of 3 applies in that there is a setup and a payoff, but oftentimes there is a reminder, making 3. The reason 3 works so well is that it establishes a pattern. 1 is random, 2 is a coincidence, but 3 is a pattern. If something happens 3 times in a work of fiction, that is something the filmmakers are intentional about. 3 times is essentially the filmmaker screaming at you to remember this piece of information. At this point in Psycho, the officer shows up across the street at the dealership, marking his 2nd appearance. It hasn't reached the rule of threes yet, but the audience is suspicious about the officer. The 2 being so close together feels intentional, so the audience is expecting the officer's return to complete the rule of threes. However, Hitchcock knew this and uses this as a misdirection for the audience. Because the audience expects the officer's return, this is the last scene that the cop is in. The cop is Chekhov's gun on the mantle, and again, it never goes off. So at this point, this is what has been set up. Marion Crane is the main protagonist, played by seasoned actress Janet Leigh. Marion stole money from her employer and is on the run, and there is a cop on her tail. The next scene is Marion arriving at the Bates Motel and meeting Norman Bates, who we eventually find out is the titular psycho. Bates does act odd and definitely gives serial killer vibes, but the audience may not fully trust their instincts at this point. Based on the understanding of the story so far, it seems odd for Norman to be the killer. He isn't linked to the stolen money or the police officer, which are the 2 main conflicts set up in the film. The audience is still trying to figure out Norman, but we are reminded of the money as Marion does some math and then throws it in the toilet. This reminder brings the audience's attention away from Bates and back to the previous conflicts. Then, the film slaps you in the face with arguably the most iconic scene in cinema history. The shower scene is a pivotal moment for the film, and while modern audiences probably have already seen it from cultural osmosis, if you look at the film in a vacuum, it upheaves the entire plot. This is the opposite of paying off, the exact opposite of Chekhov's gun firing. Everything that has been set up and built up to this point in the story has meant nothing. Janet Leigh, clearly the main protagonist and big star of the film, dies at the halfway mark. This scene has a lot of downtime afterwards that makes the audience wonder what the rest of the movie will be without its protagonist. Who will be the new protagonist? What's the new central conflict? What will happen with the officer or the money? The midpoint of the film is a complete upheaval of everything set up previously. In Hitchcock's bomb speech, there is this part that many people leave out after the bomb doesn't go off. Hitchcock says that instead of the bomb going off, there's a sniper outside that shoots the characters. Psycho is a perfect example of this. The bomb is the money that we know about early on, but the money never goes anywhere. Rather, Marion getting murdered is the sniper in the window. It takes the audience completely by surprise, making the rest of the movie scarier because at this point in the plot, the audience has no idea what to expect. Literally anything could happen because the audience has lost trust in the filmmaker, but not in the negative way. Rather, it's in the way that the film's unpredictable nature can twist and turn at any moment. Then there's the actual twist of the movie that it's most well known for. Spoiler alert for a movie that is over 60 years old now, and you probably already know the twist, but the killer isn't Norman's mother, but rather Norman Bates himself, dressed as his mother and psychologically believing he is his mother. Strangely enough, I think that this is the most well set up aspect of the film, as long as you pay close attention to the filmmaking language that Hitchcock uses. A defining characteristic of Hitchcock's style is perspective, POV, and voyeurism. In many of his films, he will use point-of-view shots to track where a character is looking. He made an entire film about that concept called Rear Window. In Vertigo, Hitchcock uses a camera technique called a dolly zoom to replicate the visual effects of vertigo from the main character's perspective. If there's anything Hitchcock knows, it is how to show someone's perspective. But for some reason, we never see Mrs. Bates even when she was talking. The first time we hear her is a shot from outside the house with only off-screen dialogue. When we see the shower scene, the killer arises out of the shadows, which makes sense, but once the curtain is pulled back, we should see their face completely, but instead we just see a black void. This was clearly intentional, so Hitchcock is hiding something about the mother since we've noticed multiple scenes where the mother is obtusely hidden. Knowing that there would be no reason to obscure her face other than specifically hiding something should signal to the audience that something is amiss. I find it so interesting that the biggest and most memorable twist from this film is the one that is easiest to guess. Nobody would have guessed that the cop never shows up again, or that the money would never show up again, or that getting a new car was irrelevant. But attentive viewers could definitely guess that it was Norman all along. Psycho changed the landscape of the horror genre in many ways, and I think Hitchcock's utilization of Chekhov's unfired gun is an excellent example in how horror would be portrayed after 1960. In the 30s and 40s, the horror genre was dominated by the universal monsters, monstrous but entirely fictional beings from far-off lands. There were also alien movies like Thing from Another World and Invasion of the Body Snatchers that used horror as a metaphor for communism and foreign powers. But Psycho invigorated the trend of domestic horror. Horror isn't derived from foreign entities, but rather in our backyards, at a motel on the side of the road, in a house you drive by every day. That is why after Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Halloween, Night of the Living Dead, and so on were made. And I think the domestic horror is amplified by Hitchcock's bomb-under-the-table strategy and betrayal of Chekhov's gun. It makes the film unpredictable and erratic, mirroring real life. The fictional Dracula can be defeated with garlic, but the unknown killers of the world are in plain sight and are unable to be identified until it's too late.